Jesse will continue to let people in and we'll get this started out of respect for everybody's time. Thanks for being here. Welcome to an honest conversation about grief. Life is messy, so is loss. As someone who spent the first 6 months of 2018 navigating a parent's diagnosis, a favorite uncle's near fatal illness, a miscarriage, and ultimately the loss of a parent, while having a 2-year-old and working as a counselor witnessing others' pain and loss, I feel very passionate about the importance of talking about grief, of validating it, of normalizing it. So let's start with that. Grief is a healthy and natural reaction to a loss of any kind. It isn't a problem to be solved. But just because it's healthy and natural doesn't make the experience less painful or difficult. As a culture, we're a bit grief avoidant. Our culture has a tendency to hold a narrow view of what qualifies as worthy of grief, often minimizing pain by comparing it to others. This makes grief even more challenging than if we spoke of it openly and acknowledged it. So thank you to everyone who showed up today. We see you and appreciate you. At the end of the hour, we hope you have a little more space to breathe, understand grief a little bit more, and hopefully have some ideas for supporting yourself and others. This program is for you. So if you have questions or if you have insights you want to share, please speak up, whether through the chat or by coming off mute. And if at any time today you feel a bit overwhelmed by the conversation and want support, reach out to Jessie. She will connect with you. As a reminder, the Lawyer Assistance Program is a free and confidential program available to DC bar members, judges, and law students in the district. We do assessments, short-term counseling, referrals, support groups, and consultations with concerned others. Don't hesitate to contact us if you need something. Jessie will share that information in the chat. And if anyone is joining us from out of state, we know that each state has a version of a lawyer assistance program. And Jessie will also put resources into the chat so you can find your local lab. As a reminder, the program's recorded. So if you aren't able to stay for the whole conversation, we will share the recording and resources afterwards. And otherwise, I'm going to jump right in and introduce the panelists really briefly and kind of move along quickly. So Heather Horton is a wonderful resource we have, she's a volunteer with the Lawyer Assistance Program and on the Lawyer Assistance Committee, and is a grief coach herself. And then Sharon Greenbaum is one of the senior lap counselors here at the Lawyer Assistance Program. So thank you both for joining us for this conversation. All right, so jumping in, Heather, I'm going to start with you. Can you just discuss a little bit what is grief? What do we talk about? What do we mean when we talk about grief?
Thank you, Nikki, for that question, and welcome everyone. Grief is literally the normal and natural reaction to loss or change, transition. So it's actually more than physical death. It's something we experience on a daily basis, but we don't label it as that, because if you just took a second to recognize changes or transitions that happen in your day, those experiences produce grief. It may not produce grief to the degree that it stops you in your tracks, but it is still something that needs to be processed before you can move on to the next thing. Grief is a neglected and misunderstood process. It's actually something we should embrace, but most of us run from it.
You're still muted.
2 years later, still.
It happens.
I was just going to give you some space to add to that, and if not, maybe talk a little bit about what does grief look like.
Sure. I'm sorry, I was going to just jump in real fast. I think that, like what Heather was saying, right? It's important to embrace it. It's also good to sort of know what it might look like and what it might not look like. And I think for a lot of people, we think about crying, right? And that is the only expression of grief. But in actuality, it can really come out as anger, frustration, feeling overwhelmed, and even rage for some people. You know, I think that sometimes we want to find something or someone to blame so we can make sense of it. And that goes across any type of grief, right? Essentially, it's when what we like to say as therapists, when you're feeling dysregulated. And that sort of gives you sort of insight into how your feelings are manifesting. I think also sometimes we think about, we don't really think about the physical aspects, right? So we talked a lot about in the last 2.5 years about chronic stress. Grief can also come out in that way. And what I mean by that is you can have like physical pain, inflammation, digestive issues, headaches. And like we know in the past 2.5 years, that can really lower your immunity, right? And you might even get a cold or not feel well. And that is also some ways that it might come across. Go ahead, Heather.
Yeah, I will also want to point out grief can show up as conflicting feelings. For example, when someone is suffering from a terminal illness and they eventually die, the people that are left have conflicting feelings. One, they are happy that the person is no longer suffering. However, there is a void that is left that they also have to deal with. So there is relief that they are no longer suffering, but there's also the void. So it's when you have conflicting feelings or lingering feelings, that signals unresolved grief or grief itself. And grief is also not about a broken brain, but it's about a broken heart. And I think if we put it in that perspective, more of us would embrace it rather than run from it.
Wonderful example. As you were saying that, what came up for me is a couple of things right, parents, like empty nesters, right? Like your children go off to college. There's this conflicting feeling that happens. There's a grief of not having the child at home, and you're so happy that they are starting this next chapter of their life that is good for them, right? Like being able to hold the and, I think is so important and so challenging. It's leaving a job and finding a new one, right? I'm leaving these colleagues that I love, but there's this amazing opportunity for me down the road that I need to take. It's the end, I think, a lot of times.
Yes. The end of or the change in any familiar pattern of behavior. That is grief.
How do we know what, though, is kind of like typical versus atypical reactions in grief? I think that's a question a lot of people struggle with because we don't talk about what grief looks like.
Interesting. Grief is unique to you. And so atypical versus typical, it's whatever you're feeling. The emotions that you're feeling are unique to you. No one can tell you when to grieve, how long to grieve. Just feel.
And I would add to that too. Yes, there's no one way to grieve or not to grieve, but also to recognize that if you or someone that you love seems to be at a 10 all the time, it means that they might just need more support or more resources. That might be a little atypical in the sense that they're not coping well or not coping at all. And those are some things we'll get into what to look for, but like just to remember, even if it's not about you, to keep your eyes open about the other folks in your life as well.
Yeah.
And one thing, kind of just want to jump in. Also, I think recognizing the relationship that you had with that person or the loss, that may impact your conflicted feelings. So if that was a challenging relationship, understand that you may feel anger that relationship never really had a resolution, but also still grieving that person lost. So that relationship also can dictate your response, your grief response.
Thanks, Jessie. I think that's such an important part. And connecting to that. So, right, all of that comes back to there is no right way. Nobody does it the exact same, which is not the answer most people want. They like, particularly lawyers, like very clear, like guidelines and paths, and this is what I'm supposed to do next. I would emphasize kind of the ebb and flow, but I do think one of the things to think about is maybe what Sharon was talking about is, right, thinking about somebody every day, normal, right? Like I've lost somebody, it's 6 months later, and I know my mom thinks about my dad almost every day. It has been 4 years. She talks about that. What she doesn't say, though, is it's 4 years later and I'm breaking down every day and not able to kind of get out of bed, or it's preventing me from moving forward in ways that I need to. And I think that's the space where we can look at not from a dysfunction, but impeding the ability to live. And I think that is important. I also think death can often increase loss of any kind, actually. I don't want to just talk about death, but change, the ending, can increase our own anxiety sometimes. So looking at how anxiety shows up and whether that's interfering, not from dysfunction, but from like Sharon said, do I need some more support? Right? Am I afraid of my own mortality or other people's mortality now that I've lost somebody? And now I'm clinging in a way that is making it really difficult to function.
Yeah.
Normal responses, right? But maybe still need some additional help. Heather, look like.
Yeah, and really asking yourself the question, in the present, what did I lose? Maybe write all of that down. What value did this add to me? And it may seem like, well, nothing at first, but really self-reflect, do some self-reflection and think about, what am I now able to do that I couldn't do before I lost this thing, or this thing changed, or this situation changed? Because most times we're looking at things from an unbalanced view. If you're only looking at what you lost, you're unbalanced. And so it's hard to move forward or hear any positive thing about what happened. But if you look at, what did this thing, how did this bring value to me? Or what have I gained? Or what were the memories that this person left with me?
So that,
Those
right.
are the things that we need to look at in order to be able to move forward in an emotionally healthy way.
I like that last. Go ahead, Sharon. Go ahead.
I'm just gonna add, and like beyond death, right? Like what we're all seeing with clients, you know, for as long as COVID has been around at this point. Now, right? Like almost like with every season and with every change in the political scene or in the health scenario, there's still grief, right? And it's recognizing what I have lost and what might never be again, which is really hard for people, right? Really hard for us, really hard for any human, to be able to say, like, things may never be what they were in that instance, you know, whether it is home life, school life, anything really, and to really find community for that, right? Like you can't really go through this by yourself, and yet when you're isolating, that is also a part of grief too, right? It is easier to draw in as opposed to saying how you're feeling.
Agreed. And those are some of the things that we gravitate to that are not bad in and of themselves. It's not bad for us to isolate and recharge ourselves. But if we do that to avoid feeling, then that's when it causes long-term damage.
I think that, or like the one prescription is to feel, I think, with grief.
Yeah.
And it's the hardest one because it's the most painful. So I would tie that into this question of kind of like, are there other misconceptions about grief that you would want to address for people? Sharon, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I think we might have already said is that grief isn't linear, right? There's literally no timetable. I know in working with clients where they feel like they don't have time to grieve, they might be caring for several children and, you know, a full-time job, and they're like, I literally don't have time, right? And so there's going to be ebbs and flows of how that feels over a lifetime, and maybe you have to take time. You know, on a Friday afternoon and schedule some time to cry, right? That we talk about all the time with our colleagues. And also to recognize what we talked about before, right? Like crying isn't the only expression of grief. I know in some cultures it's considered embarrassing and you shouldn't be crying in front of people. I think also, you know, some people have learned from an early age, right, to not express your emotions. I think a good way to think about it is like, if you broke your leg, would you not treat the injury, right? And I think also another misconception is that time heals all wounds. Like I feel like every movie and book like ends that way, and the passing of time can diminish the intensity, but it doesn't necessarily heal everything.
Agreed.
I'm going to say something. I had listened to a grief training a while ago that I really like this concept in terms of healing. It talks about healing does not equal healed, right? Like healing is this ongoing process, and healing is kind of where the events or the fear don't control me. But that doesn't mean the thing is done. I just think that's important to distinguish. Go ahead, Heather.
Yeah, because there's this thing about letting go or moving on. You don't do that, because we grieve because we love. What you do is you move through and you integrate loss into life, which speaks to healing being an ongoing process. I want to just, if I had a moment, to just touch on a couple of other misconceptions about grief. When we tell people don't feel bad, we're in essence telling them not to feel. And again, as we've established in this session here, this conversation, feeling is, there's the prerequisite. Or it's part of grieving. Feeling is part of grieving. Trying to replace the loss and actually move to the next thing before looking at, again, what did I gain? What did I lose? And having that balanced view before you move forward is necessary. For instance, you may be leaving a job because you hated people there and your supervisor. Well, you're not going to be ready to walk into the new job until you go through that self-reflection process of, what did I gain? What did I lose? How do I want to show up in this next place? It's as simple as that. But trying to replace something just because it ended or you didn't like it is not a way to move forward. Being strong or staying strong, and even keeping busy. We as lawyers, that is the natural thing to do. We're not taught to do anything but just be strong and keep busy in law school. And so when you approach your career and your life from that perspective, you're really leaving yourself open to be anxious, overwhelmed, and not able to actually sit in the present with what's happening.
And I think too, just to add to that real fast, Heather, when you're talking about keeping busy and moving forward and staying strong and moving on, that almost, when you were saying that, was hitting me as, that's my issue, right? Like if I'm saying that to you, right? It's my discomfort of, if someone's saying that, it's not that it's the fact that it's a reflection on them, right? Of not being able to sit with discomfort. It's not about you being able to sit with it, which is a whole nother boundary conversation.
It is.
That also, right, one of the things we want to talk about too is how to show up for other people in grief. And I think that's an important piece too, right? That I think we're so action oriented sometimes that we think we need to do things for others. And often it is really about showing up and listening, which is kind of the hardest thing to do because it's uncomfortable to be in other people's pain. So do either of you have any thoughts on that, on kind of what that might look like?
Yeah, silence is golden, like you said, just showing up. Also, asking the person what support do they need, and not putting yourself in the position of being the one to support them. What I didn't say was, how can I support you? I said, what support do you need? And continue to ask that question. Don't ask it just once, because the first time you ask it, the person may not know what they need. But as time goes on, there may be something that they need that you can actually facilitate, not necessarily be the one supporting.
I love that. I think that's really important. And it's also giving people grace, because not everybody knows that that's the question to ask, right? So that is helpful in sharing that as well, because we don't know until we've lost somebody. Not just losing somebody, but in that case, I think that's really helpful. I think it's also like remembering that it takes time, and it takes time to process as well. Sometimes I think, right, like as attorneys, like we have to compartmentalize, as people, we have to compartmentalize and sort of like circle back, but it's like the circling back that matters, because it's always about our feelings, and we don't want to do this with our feelings, right? But it might not be the time of day or the week that we have time to acknowledge them, right? Or even have the space to help somebody else acknowledge their feelings. But it doesn't hurt it only helps to ask the question. And like Heather said, like that's next week, next month, next year, and checking in.
I want to share, and there's something you talked about, kind of like the time and processing, right? And acknowledging life is full, right? Everybody has lots of things on their plate. And often we do need to compartmentalize, right? Like, because we have to get the memo done, get the kid to school, whatever it is that we need to do, right? So, but it's that piece of making sure you're circling back to find the time to process. And also having a person to do that with. It could just be one person. You know, and whether that is a friend, a family member, a religious entity, whether that is a professional, whatever that looks like, it's having that space, right? Because if we don't process it, it gets stuck.
Yes.
So I think having one space where you can answer that question truthfully, how are you doing? And not just say fine. I think it's really important.
And I think we need to start asking each other different questions, because the immediate response to how are you doing is fine. Without any thought, it just comes off of our lips. And so a different question is what's causing you pain right now? Or I'm concerned about you. What support do you need? We just said that, but I'm saying it again because we have to ask each other those questions repetitiously. Repetition breaks down barriers and walls. It's not about you not remembering or asking too much. You can never ask too much. People are precious.
I think a question we get people ask a lot is kind of like, how do I know when my grieving is over? You know, when am I done?
When you take your last breath. That may sound very morbid, but again, when I started, I said grief happens to us every day. So as long as we are breathing, things change. We lose things, transition comes. So you will be grieving for life, which is why it is so important to learn how to manage your emotions, because every day something changes.
That's a great point. I think too, just to jump in for a second, I think that depending upon, you know, your culture, your religious background, your ethnicity, etc., you know, every culture has different rituals, right? Which that's all, you know, we can get into all the specifics, but I think that as humans, we don't like change, and we want things to stay the same, which is not how things are going to go, especially as we have seen. And while it can be difficult and very disruptive in terms of loss of life, right? But any type of grief can be very disruptive. Sometimes it's really helpful to like have a ritual or a practice that is either honoring that person, honoring that situation that was going to happen, or that life cycle that was going to happen that maybe shifted in a different way. But to kind of like mark it so that and that also gives you time to release your feelings, hopefully in community with other people. But it makes you stop and, again, like we always say, feel your feelings, which is great.
I think too, it gives you space to ask, what do I need right now? Right. I was just thinking of the different kinds of grief that we just talked about a couple of minutes ago on, let's say, like empty nest, right? Like kids going off to college. So taking this pause and figuring out, okay, I have a hole, right? I have this hole in my life that I did not have before because it was filled with this person and caring for this person and being in presence with this person. So like, what do I need now? And how can I get that which I need, right? Some people pick up like an additional hobby, like painting, right? Because I have this hole and I need something, a way of expressing myself. Or I've now created a new ritual of, you know, Sunday night phone calls with this person. Like, so thinking about ways that we can identify what our needs are and see if we can get those met. That doesn't, it's not always easy, but it is important, I guess, to think about. So I'm wondering if there are any other things either of you can think of that like we can do to help ourselves kind of process the grief or kind of cope actually while we're grieving, right? Like I have to go to work. I have to maybe be with friends. I might have to be with family. I might have to be with my kids. Like, how do I show up in the world while I am still feeling all of the things?
One thing is to not look at it as things you have to do, but things you get to do. And if some of the have tos are not in line with what you get to do, maybe some of those things need to come off of your task list. It gives you an opportunity to reset your identity when you have an empty nest. Again, when anything changes, when you take on a new job, when you retire, which are all grieving experiences. I will just say that. Yes, but you get to choose how you show up. I've constantly said in our conversation today, what did I gain from this? What value has this added to me, this loss or change or transition? That's the piece that allows you to be able to reset your identity, but also carry on or honor the legacy that was with the person or thing that is no longer the same.
I think too, like going back, Nikki, to what you were saying about there's always so much happening at once, right? I have this image, right, of Nikki's life personally of like the children and the family and the work and running around, right? And being able to let things go when your bandwidth is completely diminished, right? Which I think for a lot of folks is very hard to do because I want order and I want structure and I want to feel in control. And if I'm letting it go, then I'm not in control. When doing that actual thing of letting it go actually gives you more control, which I know sounds counterintuitive, but you can't increase your bandwidth in that moment. So you have to decide what's important right now. What can I do? What am I capable of? And that might be very low. And that's okay. And then maybe tomorrow it's different. And you're going to have that ebb and flow with grief where that bandwidth kind of, shrinks and gets wider. And it may never go to 100%. You may just like 30%, back to 30%, back to 40%. And also being able, like we've said in this conversation, to be able to ask for what you need.
And being okay with saying no.
Third one, right? The boundary of the no. I think you couple that right with some self-compassion, like some permission and grace. Yes. That you're not going to be at your best right now, and expecting yourself to be at your best is frankly just unrealistic.
Right. Or expecting yourself to be over
mm-hmm.
the loss of a person. Yeah. Here's sort of a barometer to measure, not that there is one, but if you've known someone for decades, don't expect to be in a space of 110% a month later, even a year later. It's not going to take you decades to move through it, but it's going to take more than a year. Again, the other piece is you cannot wait for time to heal your wounds. It's time with action that helps you to be able to integrate loss into life. And a lot of us are just waiting on time.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, I just really want to kind of elevate the comment in the chat, right? Like, it's really frustrating when we can't focus. Like, we want to be able to focus, and our brain has said, nope, not right now. Like, that's not a thing that we can do. Is there anything we can do to help ourselves in that space?
Yeah, I would say take a minute to step out of class, do a 60-second centering exercise. Just give yourself 60 seconds to be out in nature, breathe, take deep breaths. I know that may sound woo-woo, but centering yourself really works. And in the moment also, in that 60 seconds, ask yourself, how am I doing physically, emotionally, spiritually, intellectually? Ask those questions, listen to the answers, and then say, how do I want to move forward? You may be able to even do that in class. Just check out and ask yourself those 4 questions. What are the answers? How do I want to move forward?
And I think too, I know that we don't know the circumstances. I know we're talking about like Joe's comment in the chat, but it's a matter of like the degree to which the ruminating thoughts and the feelings are, you know, in terms of, are they becoming maladaptive, right? Like we don't know the circumstance, right? But if it is something where you are not able to get your work done, to focus, to get out of bed, like whatever it might be, like first of all, reach out to us, reach out to a professional so we can sort of help you move through it. But depending on your circumstance, it might be taking some time off work. It might be taking some time off from school, but depending upon what it is that you're working through. I know that in the profession, you know, that you're in, it's just go, go, go. And it sounds crazy what I'm saying, especially if you're in law school. Like, what do you mean I can take a break? But sometimes you do need to literally take a medical leave if there is something that is causing you to not be able to cope. And that is okay.
I mean, I've written notes for students before, not even taking a medical leave, but maybe needing an accommodation, right? Like maybe I need a recording of what's going on in class, whatever the situation is, but there are like accommodations that can happen when you experience, you know, loss or anxiety or depression, like whatever is kind of interfering. I think we've all gotten pretty good at writing those letters. But the same is said in any workplace or any other situation. Just the kind of recognizing what degree, I guess, it is impactful, I think can be really important. Thinking a little bit about how do we show up for others? How can I help someone else kind of in their grief?
I think that what was really helpful for me personally were folks that said, I'm just checking in, I'm going to keep checking in on you, right? And so when I've had close friends, and I'm talking about death here, who've lost someone close to them, I said, I'm going to keep checking in on you. This is a very different relationship. I'm not saying you say this to every single person. And tell me if you don't want me to, right? Because in that moment, maybe they couldn't answer the question, right, of what they need. And so I was filling in the blank for them. But you also want to make sure that you're not saying the wrong thing. And I think that's really important. Like, we don't want to have toxic positivity and just telling them everything's going to be okay, right? Or they're in a better place. I mean, it's just, we're leaning into your faith, right? If the person isn't of faith. You never want to infer and assume. You want the person to tell you how they're feeling or not feeling. And I know it sounds like we're asking you to be a therapist, but essentially, like, you just want to meet them where they are and not put your own assumptions on their circumstance.
Also not make it about you, right? Like I was thinking about, you know, I have a friend with a chronic illness and another friend tries to be supportive, but often kind of is like, I can't understand why this is happening to you. Like that kind of, right? Like the world doesn't make sense. And I'm trying to have a conversation with you about why the world doesn't make sense and bad things happen. But like, that's the wrong person to have the conversation with, right? Unless they bring it up first. If the person grieving brings it up first, have the conversation. But kind of recognize when we're kind of putting our own things on others, I think can be really important. It does require a level of self-awareness. It doesn't always happen, but like chronic illness, right? That is another significant ongoing grieving process. Are there ways we can show up for people, you know, friends and family who have chronic illnesses?
Well, get them to talk about how they're feeling. Most people don't want to ask, well, they'll ask you how you're feeling, but I guess the better question is, I know you're maybe thinking about, well, I may never get to do this or that. There may be some loss of hopes, dreams, expectations. It may sound counterintuitive, but talk about those things, because there may be some way for them to actually in some way accomplish that thing. But in the moment, they're feeling totally hopeless and like this will never happen.
I think depending upon like what the situation is, similar to a loss of a person, where there's actual moments in time where you can check in, whether that's the anniversary, the diagnosis, just like what I love is like making a note in your phone, since we all have those now, right? Where like, put it in your calendar, it alerts you, you know that your colleague lost their sister on this day, and you just say, thinking of you. Depending upon the relationship, you could do more or less. That goes so far. And you don't realize that until you are the person in the situation, or it has happened to you and you're on the receiving end. Just remembering and being present.
I was thinking about that kind of question, even just like the how are you, right? Which is very generic and we usually don't give honest answers, but almost like even coming back, just like, how are you doing today? Right? Like, because how are you feels so big. Like, how is today going for you? Like, that can be very, like, I can answer that. I can't answer how are you, but I can answer how I am doing today. So just thinking about small ways. And I want to kind of also elevate what Jessie had put in the chat. She was just talking about like how grief impacts our mental health, right? Which impacts performance in all aspects of our lives. And like just coming back to that permission, which can be really challenging. And I'm going to make sure I'm going to put it out there. If anybody has questions, please put them in the chat. Please feel to come off. And while we kind of wait to see if anybody has questions, we're going to have Heather and Jessie do a quick role play for us as two colleagues in the workplace. One who has experienced loss recently. Jessie has experienced loss recently, and Heather is the colleague who knows her.
Jessie, I'm glad to see you back in the office.
Thanks.
But you look a little down. Tell me.
Well, besides everyone looking at me like I'm about to fall apart, I don't know why I'm here yet. But I have to be here because I just can't stay home. I can't.
Well, I'm glad to see you. What support do you need?
I don't know. I really don't. I mean, I've been through this before. This is not my first pregnancy loss. I don't know why I'm feeling like this. I've gone through this before. I know what this feels like.
What does it feel like?
Like something's wrong with me.
What else?
That I will never have that dream.
So what I'm hearing you say is you're dealing with a loss of hopes, dreams, and expectations, not only for this baby, but maybe the other one too.
Yeah. And, everyone expects me to be okay. They're checking in, but they don't really want to talk about it. They don't know what to say. I don't know what I want them to say.
That's a great awareness.
I'm just tired, and I got to be work and pretend everything's okay and handle these cases and these clients like my life's not falling apart.
I can't imagine what you're feeling, but know that I'm here.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I would ask if you just kind of keep this conversation private. I don't want everyone to know what I'm feeling right now. I just need to be at work. I need the work right now. I don't want it, but I need it.
And how is your husband or your partner?
He's not talking much. He's acting like everything's okay. We're not talking to each other about it. We're just planning for the next try.
What do you want to say to him?
Tell me how you're feeling. Say something. Act like this hurts.
When will you do that?
I don't know. I don't know if I want to hear it. I
How
can't
did you-
deal with this because I don't know how I feel.
Okay. How did you feel when you first got pregnant?
Happy. It's a dream, you know, what I always wanted.
How did he feel?
Excited as well, but I think he was a little bit more pessimistic. I'm just tired. I think I'm just tired.
What are you tired of?
Everything. Just everything.
Is there something more than the miscarriages?
No. I don't know. I probably just need to get back to work. I think, you know, thank you. I really appreciate you reaching out, but I think I just need to get back to work. I think I need to focus on this work right now.
Well, whenever you are feeling like you need someone, know that I'm here
Thank
and I
you.
continue to check on you.
I appreciate it. Pass it to you, Nikki.
I'm just gonna
Well,
actually,
just highlight what Doug says. I think
yeah,
exactly what I said. It's just, I know I'm going through a pain. The looks that people give you can be sometimes as painful
Mhm.
because it's a reflection of what you're feeling.
And a great question to them could be, how is this adding value to me? And you can do it with a smile. You don't have to feel, it doesn't have to say it like you're cutting them off, but that is how you educate people on what they're doing, because they may not even realize that they're staring at you, or
Mhm.
they may. But it gets a conversation going about a very sensitive topic that we need to talk more about versus just everybody going to their sides.
do you think sometimes it's helpful just to acknowledge it's a sensitive topic, right? Like if you're noticing people looking at you or avoiding you or whatever it is they're doing, right? Sometimes we don't have the capacity to do that, and we shouldn't have to. But if we do, like being able to acknowledge, like, I know this is hard, or like it, whatever that is. Jesse, I guess I wanted to hear from you kind of what was helpful about kind of what Heather did, and is there anything you would have wanted differently?
I think identifying what I was feeling initially, the two losses. Because again, I think we are so programmed to just see loss in one way, but understanding it's more than just that loss.
Mhm.
There's more to that loss. And I think just listening, recognizing that you're not going to fix what that person is feeling. You know, you're not, what that conversation, that support is not going to erase those feelings. So just being able to listen, be able to ask that person, what support do you need? You know, kind of speaking to Felicia, your comment in the chat room, what support you need sometimes could just be listening, you know, and maybe that person can identify what they want right now, and maybe you can facilitate them getting those resources. But sometimes it may start with just listening and hearing from that person what they may need.
I think too, to Maria's point in the chat about feeling like you couldn't, and I'm sorry this happened to you, like you were expected to get over the death of your father, and then the way people were reacting, you sort of stopped talking about it or didn't talk about it. I think too, not to put the onus on us, but if we can be the person to be the example, right? Like what Heather was doing for Jesse in the situation, then hopefully the next time, right, something comes up in the office setting, people will see, oh, I mean, not to say that they're going to see Heather's conversation with Jesse, but like it kind of like has a ripple effect in terms of creating a different environment. And this does not happen overnight. And obviously, I'm speaking very biased, working on a team of therapists. But it has to start somewhere. And if you're not seeing it, it can always start with you.
I wanted to, so shifting a little bit, but I wanted to acknowledge kind of Robert's comment is the multitude of feelings, right? Like, so we can have relief maybe when somebody passes because they've been in pain. And like, then sometimes when that caretaking stops, I think we sometimes don't realize what toll it took. Right? Like anticipatory grief has its own toll, meaning that we're like waiting for this thing to happen. We know it's coming or we think it's coming, and there's a wait before it actually happens. Actually, I think I was thinking about like pet loss, right? Like oftentimes we know the pet is kind of nearing the end of life, or they are sick and we're going to have to make a decision about what we're going to do with them. And that's anticipatory grief. And then there's the actual loss that happens. So there's just a lot of kind of different processing that can happen throughout that space, even before the actual loss.
And we also can't pre-grieve.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I think that, right, like as an attorney, like what can I do? We have client, back in the day when we had clients come to the office, they'd come in with like a notebook, like I'm ready, right? Like, no, close the notebook. There's no like step 1, step 2, step 3, unfortunately, except for being aware and being present and spending that time that you have left, if that is something that you want to do, if that is the relationship. But knowing that you're not going to know how you feel until it happens.
What? I think you can pre-grieve, and I've never heard that word before, but what I would say is, even in the anticipation, as you said, focus on the relationship and what time you do have left. And maybe there's something that's still unresolved in that relationship that you can work through now, because here's what happens when a death happens. We are grieving the living relationship, but we're also grieving the void that is left by that person. And if you know that there is some anticipatory something happening, you have the opportunity now to work through those things that are still unresolved. Because when that person dies and there's still unresolved grief, you're dealing with the unresolved grief plus the void. And that it can be a conflicting feeling, because if you didn't have a great relationship and now you're also just missing them for the sake of missing them, that is hard to reconcile. And to Doug's comment in the chat, it leads to us feeling guilty. However, I want to very clearly look at the definition of grief and notice that guilt requires intent to harm for the most part. There are statutory things, but grief requires intent to harm. If there is no intent to harm, put guilt back in the dictionary. I don't know why I keep saying grief. Guilt back in the dictionary, because again, guilt requires intent to harm. Most times we are not intending to harm people by the actions that we take. If there is, then there needs to be some reconciliation there. But it's not guilt. We're looking for something to blame, as Sharon said earlier. But if there's no intent to harm, guilt's not the term for you.
We might be feeling maybe then regret, like, right? Like, I think there are things that we can feel, particularly depending on what that loss looks like. And I was just, I'm thinking of clients, like I have a client who has a past client, right? Like who lost somebody to suicide. And I think a lot of times regret actually probably might be a more accurate, right? Like description, but I think we identify it as guilt. Like I did something wrong, or shame, right? Like I'm not a good cousin, brother, sister, mother, because I didn't do X, Y, and Z to kind of like prevent it from happening. That's a little bit more shame based. Like I'm not good enough. I didn't do something good enough. And that can get us stuck. And I think that's very like an incredibly normal response when we have loss like that. And actually where the benefit of talking to, like in groups, like support groups, can be really beneficial, because it's validating to hear 5 other people also had that exact same experience. And we can give others a little bit often more compassion than we can give ourselves.
Yeah.
I don't know where I was going with that, but that's just
But
kind of
no, and to Doug, I hope, Doug, that helped with the intent to harm. I'm meaning the actions that you're taking. If the actions you took were not with the intent to harm a person, then guilt, maybe regret or shame. But again, those things need to be processed as well.
One of the things, just kind of, sorry, I was kind of reading the comment. Right, it's challenging, because I think at the end of the day, because we are a grief averse culture, most people don't know how to show up for other people.
Right, because they don't know how to show up for themselves. It starts with us. And that is not a diss at people, because we weren't taught how to manage our emotions from childhood. It's not I'm not saying your parents were bad either, because they didn't teach you how to manage emotions. Because what happened is their parents didn't know how to manage emotions. So it's a cyclical thing, but someone has to decide to break that generational thing. I don't want to call it a curse. And learn how to manage emotions. This is how we manage grief. This is how we manage the ebbs and flows of life, because literally that is what grief is, the ebbs and flows of life. It is uncomfortable, but we have to get comfortable being uncomfortable in order for us to feel differently, us to integrate loss into life. Again, it's about embracing grief, not running from it. Because what we resist persists. And if you don't deal with it today, it will show up in another way, in that anger, that rage that Sharon talked about earlier.
I also just want to acknowledge Mary's comment in the chat here, right? I know Jesse replied to you. I think that in American in society, right, like only speaking to our country, it is so much easier to talk about things that we can see. Like that goes beyond grief. Like we don't really ask about people's invisible illness, right, or chronic illness. And so with grief, like it's not in front of you unless you've experienced it. And so I'm really sorry that happened to you, and that is awful. It's also not surprising that the average person spoke to the person who can physically see the cast on someone, as opposed to asking you how you're doing, because that might be making them feel uncomfortable, right? Because again, it's easier to know what to say when we've been through it, as opposed to not knowing what to say. And it's okay to get it wrong, right? If you're in the situation where you want to ask a colleague how they are, you might mess up the first time that you do it, right? And that's okay, but it's better to say something than to not say something, which is what I think we've seen a few times in the chat today.
I'm gonna say something, and then I'm gonna ask everybody. Jesse, I'm keeping you on. So this is, everybody can think about this while I say my next thing. It's just like kind of one thing you would recommend, like a tip, a statement, whatever it is, to like give someone to help them kind of cope. But while you all are thinking, I wanted to touch on like the survivor guilt and the guilt piece, because I think that's really important. One of the, David Kessler does a lot of work in grief, in the world of grief. But one of the things I remember at a training I went to is he talked about actually guilt, particularly survivor guilt, often accompanies loss, right? Like that it's a normal process. And it's one of the kind of stages of like healing, is being able to release the burden of that guilt, because guilt is often about control, right? Like it's about, we've lost control when somebody has died and we couldn't do anything about it, or whatever. But survivor's guilt is often, right, like we couldn't do anything about it, or I survived and they didn't. And if someone, so it's the challenge of kind of processing that loss of control. And that our mind, something I liked he said is like, our mind would rather be guilty than helpless. And that, I don't know, that resonated pretty strongly with me. Like it's like something we have to work on and through. So however we did identify that, whether it's guilt or regret or some other thing, it is often something we need to release as we go through the process. So, okay, one thing you would recommend, say to somebody to kind of help with the coping. Jesse, I'm going to let you start.
Okay, I would say if you've never experienced, again, as we said with this presentation, we recognize grief is uncomfortable. And if you've never experienced grief and you don't know what this person is feeling, acknowledge that. Say that to the person, listen, I have no idea what you're going through, but I just want to be here for you and support you. That's it. It's okay to acknowledge you're uncomfortable about trying to support them, because we recognize, again, grief is uncomfortable, but it's something that unfortunately we all will experience in some degree. So just being able to say, listen, I don't know what you're feeling, but I'm here. Let me know how I can support you.
You're muted, Sharon.
I would say unmute myself first. I think to add to that, I would say show up and offer concrete examples of what you can do to support, which I know we've said previously. But I think being really direct is helpful when someone is feeling all the things on their end. I think also to Carol's point in the chat, right? Like our families have taught us, or our upbringing has taught us how to grieve. And so that's going to look different for every person.
I guess I would say, show yourself some grace and offer grace to the people you're supporting. Because we're human first before we're lawyers or law students.
I love all of those things, and I would echo them, and then also say, believe what the other person's telling you about their own experience, right? We may not, if we had a loss, if we had a breakup, if we had a move, we may not experience the loss in the same way or as intensely or cope in the same way, but the way we can show up for others is to believe them, to kind of accept the pain that they're experiencing and support them through it. And I think that's just important because we all deal with it so differently. So kind of recognizing that, and that if you're dealing with it differently than somebody else is, that's okay. What I will end on is, if you are finding it challenging in any way, it's okay to ask for help. It's why programs like the Lawyer Assistance Program are available to you. They are a free resource, confidential, free resource. There are a wealth of other resources. Jesse put them in the chat. We are also going to send them out in an email after this. So, it's okay to ask for help. It does not mean anything. It doesn't mean you're doing it wrong. We just usually shouldn't do anything really by ourselves. We need to do it in community with other people. And I think that can be really important. So thanks everybody for showing up today. Thank you, Sharon, Heather, and Jesse for your insights. We really appreciate it. And Sharon, Jesse, and I will hang around afterwards in case anybody has some questions. I'm going to stop the recording because I know Heather has to hop.
Bye-bye. Thank you.